The use of French on Canadian postage stamps, money, and eventually important government documents eventually followed gradually from Confederation until the Official Languages Act of 1969 and the 1982 Constitution Act imposed official bilingualism on Canada. Official bilingualism was created and sustained by federal governments from the 1950s to the present, primarily to preserve the status of French in our national life, precisely because the overwhelming majority of Canadians speak English or aspire to speak English, and thus the preservation of French was deemed by the English-speaking majority to be a national good. Why? To undermine nationalism in French Canada, in French Quebec, not to provide second language opportunities to the 80% or so of Canadians who speak only English and who have no intention of speaking anything else. Canada is clearly not bicultural either. Culture is a tricky characteristic to identify. Most of us in this room, at first glance, would probably agree with the proposition that a francophone culture exists in Quebec. But if we look more closely at that culture, we find large numbers of immigrants from Haiti, West and North Africa, Lebanon, other areas in the Middle East such as Syria, and francophones who are Roman Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, and Jews, and a large number who reject organized religion altogether. At the turn of the 20th century, French Quebecers such as Abbé Lionel Groux could define Quebec culture as rural, agrarian, and Roman Catholic, but who would define it that way today? And then there is Jacques Parizeau, whose parting words after the 1995 referendum denounced those Quebecers who don't fit the definition of pur lain as having not supported separation in the referendum. Could all French speakers in Quebec be said to have a single culture, let alone Acadians, Franco-Manitobans, and other French speakers across the country? Outside Quebec, the notion of a single English-Canadian culture is clearly completely wrong and historically inaccurate. So-called English Canadians, and I say so-called because although they or we, I'm definitely one of them, are certainly English-speaking, we can hardly all be lumped together as having come from England. We don't share a single culture, and we never did. The people I drink scotch with and eat haggis with on Robbie Burns night each January in Calgary would have me lynched at the very thought that they have English roots. The millions of Canadians who speak English and who were born or whose parents or grandparents were born in China, India, Pakistan, the Philippines, Latin America, or Africa can hardly be said to have the same or even similar cultural roots, nor can Canada's Aboriginal people. The Canada that was created in the 1860s was a country with Roman Catholic and Protestant English speakers who took their religious differences very seriously, who came mainly from Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England, but also from the United States, Germany, Scandinavia, and other countries. On June 12th and on St. Patrick's Day each year, Protestant Irish and Roman Catholic Irish took to the streets of Montreal and Toronto to beat each other's heads in. They both spoke English, sort of. But what else did they have in common culturally? The political deadlock of the 1860s, which led to the creation in 1864 of the Great Coalition that forged Confederation, was not a deadlock of English-speaking Canadians versus French-speaking Canadians. It was a deadlock of 5 political parties who could not come together to form a stable majority government. 2 were French-speaking and 3 English-speaking. They represented religious, regional, and occupational interests, Roman Catholic Ontarians, and English-speaking Catholics from Quebec. These people, for example, backed, in Ontario, Quebec, Roman Catholics generally backed the Liberal Party, as it was called, under John Sandfield Macdonald. Roman Catholic French-speaking Quebecers backed Georges Etienne Cartier's Parti Bleu. Protestant Ontarians backed either John A. Macdonald's Liberal Conservative Party or George Brown's Clear Grits, while anti-clerical Francophones in Quebec supported the Parti Rouge. A Protestant grit farmer with American roots from London, Ontario, and a Roman Catholic Highland Scottish mill owner from Montreal had very little in common, even though they both spoke English. They probably believed their interests were irrevocably opposed. On top of all the cultural differences that mark English speakers in Canada, we are also a nation of regions. Each region has cultural characteristics all its own, and celebrates those cultural characteristics in dozens, if not hundreds, of different ways. And each region has distinct political interests. Just ask Allison, Redford, and Dalton McGuinty. I'm not arguing here that Canada is a multicultural nation as opposed to a bicultural nation. Multiculturalism, as enunciated by the federal government beginning in the 1960s, was and is a sop to the millions of Canadians like me whose origins are not from the British Isles or France. I'm arguing that trying to shoehorn a nation of immigrants, which Canada was in the 1860s, no less than in 1900 or now, let alone Canada's First Nations, into some artificial mold called biculturalism is reductionism of the highest order. In fact, we are not only not bicultural, we have a single political culture in Canada. It is based on a combination of what we inherited in the British parliamentary system and what uniquely Canadian twists we began to add even before we became the Dominion of Canada in 1867. We have built national infrastructures, both physical and cultural, to strengthen that political system. But at the same time, we still maintain loyalties to our cities, townships, counties, and parishes, our provinces, our regions, our religions, or our lack of religions, to myriads of causes and pursuits, and of course, to families, ethnic and national origins, and even sports teams. Back when the Blue Jays really did play good baseball, I was a rabid Blue Jay fan, even living in Calgary. I will always hate the Leafs. We Canadians are far too complex a people, well, I'm from Montreal, and a nation to label ourselves simply as bicultural. And we are most certainly not binational, despite the history of certain politicians, most recently Prime Minister Stephen Harper, to pander to Quebec nationalism by championing the idea over the last 5 decades that Quebec is half of a Canadian dual monarchy, which is another definition of binationalism. Binationalism arose from the compact theory of confederation, first proposed by a number of provincial premiers meeting in the 1887 Interprovincial Conference. The conference was in part a reaction to John A. Macdonald's national policy and what the premiers perceived as a federal power grab in a number of key constitutional and legislative areas. There's no time here to go into the details of the premier's demands, but I will take a moment to explain the fantasy-ridden notion that much of Ottawa's power was not legitimate because Confederation was a compact between the provinces, which is what the premiers claimed. And they claimed that since it was a creation of the provinces, Ottawa's legislative legitimacy derived from the provinces. And that was completely wrong. The Dominion government was created by the Parliament at Westminster, period. And to underscore that reality, if underscore were needed, the Dominion government appointed the provincial lieutenant governors and had wide powers of disallowance. Why would the provinces have allowed that? The compact theory of confederation evolved in Quebec under Maurice Duplessis' Tremblay Commission of the mid-1950s into the idea that although the Dominion or national government was created by a provincial compact to tackle matters of taxation, fiscal legislation, and what would become known as equalization, Canada was also created as a compact between Ottawa, representing English Canada, and Quebec City, representing French Canada, in matters cultural. Put another way, Canada consisted of deux nations who were alleged to be equal in status and stature. Or so Quebec Premier Daniel Johnson claimed in the 1960s when he sought equality or independence. How am I doing on time?
5 minutes.
From time to time and to varying degrees, the federal NDP and the federal Conservatives have pandered to those who hold that Canada is a binational country. That was certainly Robert Stanfield's position, but search high and low in either the BNA Act of 1867 or the Constitutional Act of 1982, and neither the concept nor the words can be found. The people of Anglophone Canada, and I'll include New Brunswick in that group for argument's sake, soundly rejected that notion when they voted down the Charlottetown Accord in 1992, believing that incorporating a special status for Quebec was just another way of according Quebec City the status of capital city of one of Canada's two nations. Now, our Parliament, in its wisdom, declared Quebec to be a nation within Canada, but it did so at a time of minority government when all 4 parliamentary parties were sweating after Quebec votes, but the words were legislatively meaningless. For example, if Quebec forms a nation within Canada, what does that make the rest of Canada or ROC? Are the other 9 provinces the other nation within a binational Canada? To paraphrase Lord Durham, do we have 2 nations, Quebec and ROC, warring within the bosom of a single state? Who then is the Prime Minister of ROC? Where is its capital? I know that probably all of you here think it's within the site of the CN Tower. We in Calgary have got other ideas, of course. Now, to summarize, Canada has 2 official languages, English and French. There's no doubt about that. But the proposition we're debating here tonight is that Canada is A, bilingual, B, bicultural, and C, binational. In my view, all 3 are artificial constructs that don't reflect Canada constitutionally, legislatively, or in its real existence. Canada did not have 2 founding peoples. It did not rest on 2 linguistically based cultures, and it is not a state consisting of 2 nations within 1 constitutional structure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Over to you, Antonia.
I'm hoping everyone can hear me and see me as well. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Bliss. When Professor Granitstein contacted me about being part of this debate, my first hesitation was the double not. So Canada is not bilingual, binational or bicultural. That was the first problem. The second problem was I was wondering whether in Toronto national sentiment extended to being part of the Leafs Nation, which I really didn't want to have part of. And one of the things that Professor Bercuson and I have in common is that we're both from Montreal, so we don't have to tell you what that means about not only the hockey team, but everything else that's about Toronto, more or less, at least when we were growing up. Today, or tonight rather, I'd like to argue 3 points: that Canada is bilingual, binational, and bicultural. We cannot airbrush the French fact out of Canada's history or present. We cannot deny that 2 national characters are flourishing. And we need to recognize that multiculturalism does not exist in a vacuum. And paradoxically enough, I'd like to begin with a quote from an American. "The facts," John Adams once wrote, "are stubborn things." And when asked to debate a topic that risks riling so many, as it's obviously riled Professor Bercuson, namely the question of bilingualism and its implications for Canada's search for national meaning and cultural identity, I think it's best that we start with the facts before us. Many of my historian colleagues, and here I'm going to do the confession that I'm not an historian, but many historians do bemoan the existence of so many competing narratives in the teaching of Canadian history. And yet, we should begin with some historical facts that we know are out there, even though we may fail to recognize their importance. The political entity that we call Canada, for all of its wonders and all of its warts, began its history in the European sense of the term as a French fact. And through a series of events that engaged myriad different peoples across the North American continent, up the St. Lawrence Valley, down to the 13 colonies, through the Caribbean islands, and in continental Europe and the high seas around it, events that can be seen as part of this continuous Anglo-French rivalry that lasted practically a millennium, or in a narrower but just as momentous time frame of a more recent struggle between European powers in and for the New World. Regardless, the French fact is what rooted that European experience in what would become British North America, a fact established by Champlain and his settlements and later enshrined in the Royal Proclamation born of the Treaty of Paris, which not only recognized Aboriginal peoples and their treaty-making power, but also offered the protection of British governors to Roman Catholics in the newly formed province of Quebec and in the Caribbean as well, much to the chagrin of English merchants and plantation owners. And of course, the Quebec Act of 1774, which in effect granted a distinct, quote-unquote, status to this new British colony by guaranteeing state protection of the French language, the Catholic religion, and French property and civil laws, this time to the chagrin of American colonials as well. Depending on how you look at it, that 1774 Act became the bane of American existence, one of the most egregious of the intolerable acts that John Adams and his fellow revolutionaries enumerated, leading to Britain's loss of the 13 colonies, or it could be said to have been the single most important initiative that helped ensure that the French in Quebec would support the British regime throughout the War of Independence and paradoxically save the Brits' bacon in North America.